So as I mentioned, I'm talking about Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner today. Let me share my screen. I know I have a little froggy today for some reason. So, they are both American painters. And here's Jackson Pollock, and also behind me is Jackson Pollock. And he's known for his drip paintings, and also that he paints on the floor. He puts his canvases on the floor. So he lived from 1912 to 1956 as an American painter and a major figure in the abstract and expressionist movement. He's widely noticed for his technique of pouring or splashing liquid household paint onto a horizontal surface called the drip technique, and he felt it enabled him to view and paint his canvas from all angles. It's also known as all-over painting and action painting. So he covered the entire canvas and used the force of his whole body to paint, often in a frenetic dancing style. And this extreme form of abstraction divided the critics. Some praised the immediacy of the creation, while others derided the random effects. And he had a reclusive, volatile personality, and he struggled with alcoholism for most of his life. In 1945, he married artist Lee Krasner, who became an important influence on his career and on his legacy. He died at the age of 44 in an alcohol-related single car accident while he was driving. Um, so abstract expressionism, a little bit about that. It's a post-World War II art movement in American painting, developed in New York City in the 1940s. It's the first specifically American movement to achieve international influence. And it put New York on the center of the Western art world, a role formerly filled by Paris. So this particular piece was sold in 2016, titled Number 17A, and was reported to have fetched $200 million in a private purchase. And it was ranked as the 5th most expensive painting. Oopsie. Oopsie, sorry about this. I don't know what's going on here. Oh, look, it's doing subtitles. Oh no. Okay, how do I turn that off? Hold on a second. I'm gonna try to fix that. Somehow I turned on subtitles. How do I turn that off? Let's see. Let me see if I can get it to come back up. Oh, I think I turned it off. Can you see the screen now? I'm saying yes. Kat, can you see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, so we just went through that painting. Okay, I'm going to show some footage. This is actually a footage of him painting, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I'm not going to blow it up because it's not at a very high res. So I think it actually looks better small. Okay.
My home is in Springs, East Hampton, Long Island. I was born in Cody, Wyoming, 39 years ago. In New York, I spent 2 years at the Art Students League with Tom Benton. He was a strong personality to react against. This was in 1929. I don't work from drawings or color sketches. My painting is direct. I usually paint on the floor. I enjoy working on a large canvas. I feel more at home, more at ease in a big area. Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I can walk around it, work from all four sides, and be in the painting, similar to the Indian sand painters of the West. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can. I like to use a dripping, fluid paint. I also use sand, broken glass, pebbles, string, nails, or other foreign matter. A method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. Technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. When I am painting, I have a general notion as to what I am about. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident, just as there is no beginning and no end. Sometimes I lose a painting, but I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
Okay, so you got to see a little bit of him in action. And I have a few, I don't know, is that me or is that someone else who's got that noise going on here? Ah, okay, there we go. Okay, let me show another video. Am I doing it? Or can we put people on mute? I don't know if that's coming from me or someone else. Okay. Pat, are you able to put people on mute? Should I? I'm gonna mute. Oh, there, I just muted Krista. That seemed to help. Okay. Let me share the screen. Okay, this is another video about Jackson Pollock.
In 1947, Jackson Pollock started dripping, flinging, scattering, and pouring paint onto canvases spread across the floor. Some thought it was lunacy, but the most influential voices thought it genius. That's the legacy that has prevailed. That's why you've heard of him and see his work in museums. That's why a single one of his paintings can sell for $50 million. But when you find yourself in front of one of his paintings now, what do you do with it? How do you look at this and derive some sort of something from it? Why does it matter? And what does it mean now? This is the case for Jackson Pollock. Paul Jackson Pollock was born in 1912 in Cody, Wyoming, moved around the Southwest with his family, attended high school in Los Angeles, and landed in New York in 1930 to pursue art, encouraged by his older brother Charles. Pollock studied at the Art Students League under American regionalist Thomas Hart Benton, whose representational style he would go on to react against, but whose rhythmic structure and contrast of light and dark the young artist internalized. His eyes were trained on the usual suspects of European modernism, including, of course, Picasso, whom Pollock once cursed, saying, "That bastard, he misses nothing." He looked to the Mexican muralists, like José Clemente Orozco, and also David Alfaro Siqueiros, whose experimental workshop Pollock joined in 1936. Siqueiros believed the paintbrush to be an implement of hair and wood in an age of steel, and that revolutionary art required new materials like automobile lacquer and paint thinner, and innovative techniques like airbrushing, stenciling, flinging paint, and controlled accidents. Pollock incorporated some of these lessons at the time, but drew from many sources. His Southwestern childhood had sparked his interest in Native American art. He visited MoMA's 1941 show, Indian Art of the United States, several times, attending a demo of Navajo painting, made by dropping colored sand on the ground. In the early 40s, Pollock was making paintings with imagery derived from mythology and from his knowledge of Jungian analysis. The Surrealists' interest in the unconscious attracted him as well, and he was certainly familiar with their embrace of automatism, or yielding control of the making process to let the unconscious mind hold sway. So it wasn't like Pollock's drip paintings came out of nowhere. Others were doing it too. Arshile Gorky dripped in 1944, Hans Hofmann did around the same time, and Pollock was trying it out in his paintings as well. But his first big break came in 1942 with this kind of work, which was selected for a show at Peggy Guggenheim's gallery Art of This Century, having been judged by the likes of Piet Mondrian, who, having fled Europe during World War II, claimed this was the most interesting work he'd seen in America so far. Pollock's first solo show garnered much attention, his pictures described as archaic, tribal, and of elemental power. Curator James Johnson Sweeney described his talent as volcanic. It has fire, it is unpredictable, it is undisciplined. What we need is more young men who paint from inner impulsion. Guggenheim also commissioned this new talent to create a mural for her New York townhouse, and he produced an epic 19-foot-long canvas that cemented his rising star status and gave a glimpse of the rhythmic forms and loose brushwork that would follow. Pollock's other 1942 break was meeting painter Lee Krasner. They married in 1945 and moved out to Long Island near East Hampton, where they set up studios, hers in the house and his in the barn. Pollock continued to begin his paintings with totemic and mythological subjects, but painted over them with layers so thick that the original forms were mostly indistinguishable.
So I found this really fascinating because I didn't know about his underpaintings that he did that were based on mythological and Native American symbols. So I found that really fascinating. The amount of layering that he did and what was underneath at the beginning of his paintings.
By 1947, Pollock was spreading his canvases on the floor. Sometimes his initial layer involved brushwork, but successive layers were built up with poured, dripped, and scattered paint, artist's oils, enamel house paint, and aluminum radiator paint. He used sticks, trowels, and palette knives. Sometimes string, sand, or nails entered the mix. Narrative content began to disappear, until all that was visible was the splatters and skeins of paint we all now think of when we think of Pollock. The titles dropped away too, and he began to number his paintings like musical compositions. There was no sketching in advance, but it wasn't just paint flung willy-nilly, at least most of the time. To a considerable degree, he controlled his flow of paint and distribution of color. He knew what kinds of motions and what tools and paints produced certain results. He decided what to cover over and what to let show through. His all-over compositions betray a keen awareness of the edges, and after jags of activity, he would stop and take stock of what he'd done before entering back in or deciding the work was resolved. Pollock once responded to a critic's remarks by telegramming Time magazine, saying simply, "No chaos, damn it." This new work did have its critics. It was described as a child's contour map of the Battle of Gettysburg and a mop of tangled hair. Then and now, people likened his dripping to bodily spillage, vomit, pee, ejaculate, but there were many who championed this radical departure, notably the Museum of Modern Art, and art critic Clement Greenberg, who believed Pollock's drip paintings to be the culmination of the advancement of art since the dawn of modernism, charting, quote, the dissolution of the pictorial into sheer texture, into apparently sheer sensation. Pollock became a larger-than-life figure, thanks to media attention and the revelatory images made by photographer Hans Nemeth of Pollock painting in 1950. Nemeth also made a short film of Pollock at work outdoors and gave us the unforgettable view from below of Pollock painting on glass. Art critic Harold Rosenberg called this kind of work action painting, as Pollock was among a number of artists at the time for whom the canvas could be considered, quote, an arena in which to act. The term abstract expressionism began to be used to describe the work of these artists, who pursued abstraction as a means to convey emotion, each with their own distinct gesture and approach. World War II had been hell, and for Pollock and his ilk, still lifes and portraits were now insufficient. Echoing Siqueiros, Pollock explained, "New needs need new techniques. Today, painters do not have to go to a subject matter outside themselves. They work from a different source. They work from within." He had a productive pocket of years, and would return to representation with a series of paintings from 51 and 52, made with black enamel and a turkey baster, oscillating between abstraction and figuration. But in his last years, he made work only sporadically, struggling with the alcoholism that plagued him throughout his life. Pollock was at the wheel when he died in a car accident in 1956 at the age of 44, throwing his mistress from the car and killing her friend. Then and now, Pollock's brief but brilliant career was emblematic of the post-war American boom, a country no longer culturally subservient to Europe, but defining its own terms. Pollock symbolized American fearlessness and freedom, so much so that his work and that of his peers was promoted during the Cold War as proof of what was possible in a democracy, no matter that Pollock had been a member of the Communist Party. There's a tendency to think of Pollock's breakthrough as cutting the 20th century into halves, a before and an after. In 1958, artist Alan Caprow wrote, "He created some magnificent paintings, but he also destroyed painting." Of course he didn't destroy painting. He destroyed some sense of painting as a grand progression of movements from this to that. The medium has persisted, finding other innovations and other audiences. Caprow saw Pollock's legacy as pointing the way forward from painting to everything else, leaving us, quote, at the point where we must become preoccupied with and even dazzled by the space and objects of our everyday life. As Pollock reacted against Benton, many artists reacted against Pollock, against gesture, against expression. As quickly as it appeared, Pollock's signature mark-making became cliched, representing an era in American history when the art was macho and large, the art world was insular and small, and the reputed artists were almost all male and white. But where does this leave us today? When looking at his work, Pollock recommended we, quote, not look for, but look passively, and try to receive what the painting has to offer and not bring a subject matter or preconceived idea to it. Of course, no one comes to art or to anything this way, but perhaps you might appreciate the work, he suggested, quote, just as music is enjoyed. After a while, you may like it, or you may not. Ornette Coleman likened his own improvisational jazz to Pollock's work and said, it's not random. He knows what he's doing. He knows when he's finished, but still it's free form. What happens in the artist's studio is almost always a mystery. Training and expertise and persistence synthesized over time into a picture or a thing. But Pollock shows what happened to get us here, more distinctly than anyone had before. It's clear that a person was here and traversed this canvas and now he's not. Paint that was once liquid and flowing, now hardened and frozen in time. Pollock called it energy and motion made visible, and memories arrested in space. While the largeness of his persona has faded, Pollock certainly isn't absent when you're with the work. It's fun and almost irresistible to imagine being Pollock.
Okay. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting things that were said in the last couple of videos I wanted to talk about. One was just that his work was not, he said it was not chaos. Though many people may feel that that's what his drip paintings seem to suggest. But he really had a method, a time frame, the space between using gravity and using distance and the falling and the dripping to create these paintings. And I just wanted to hear what other people think about his work. Let me put this on gallery. And are there people who like his work, or the people that just that are not liking his work? I'm curious what the class thinks.
Yeah, I want to comment. I mean,
Okay.
for this abstract, I have a hard time appreciating, but I'm looking at that, I'm getting more and more appreciative of it, and it's challenging. I mean, I'm more figurative. I draw realistic things, and I find
Mm,
abstracts harder because you really have to think about it. Whereas if it's a regular realistic, it's easy for me because you're just copying nature, whatever, just transposing it, and you just see. And this one takes some more thought and emotions. And you say it's not an accident or a chaos, but at least the word I remember is control accidents or chaos. So he controls that,
uh-huh.
and it's not random. You say it's free form, and he
Mhm.
knows what he's doing. So that's what the thing is. Other than if you want to do something, as long as you purposely doing it, then I could say, yeah, you put some thought into it. But if it
Mhm.
just something just falls off on the ground, that's not art. It's just some accident. It's not. But he has thought, and it's really sophisticated. And I'm like to look more of that and try to get into that kind of painting. Maybe that's a challenge
Hmm.
to me. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Um, there was something else that he mentioned. Oh, now I've just dropped out of my head. Did anybody else have anything that they wanted to say about his work?
Well, I thought it was interesting. I thought I heard him say that he has a need to express. I don't know that he said feeling, but I thought, well, what if he said sensation? Then
Uh-huh.
his painting all of a sudden made a lot of sense to me.
Mm,
That he
I
was, yeah, no, that makes it more interesting to me.
uh-huh. I think what he said, actually, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, is that he wanted to express his emotions, but he didn't want to illustrate them. I think that was
Yeah.
the quote. So it is about sensation. I like that word, Linda, that you chose to use, because I think it is more about sensation than um, trying to draw something that looks like how he feels. It's more expressive in a different sort of way. Um,
And right. And then he lets the painting have its own life.
that's right. He mentioned that too, that a
Yeah.
painting has its own life. Yeah. Okay. So any other feedback? Okay, so I'm going to go back to my slides then and talk about Lee Krasner. Are people familiar with Lee? I think people are.
A little.
Yeah, they seem to be more familiar with Jackson. Okay. Okay. So Lee and Jackson got married in 1945, and they moved out of New York to East Hampton on the South Shore of Long Island. And they got the help of a down payment loan from Peggy Guggenheim, and they bought a wood framed house and barn out on Springs Fireplace Road. And Pollock converted the barn into a studio, and in that space, he perfected the big drip technique that we saw. And Lee actually was in the house with her studio. Her influence on her husband's art was something that critics began to reassess later in the 1960s due to the rise of feminism at the time. And she had extensive knowledge and training in modern art and techniques, and helped bring Pollock up to date with contemporary art. And she's often considered to have taught her husband the dominant tenets of modernistic painting. And Pollock was able to change his style and to fit more into this cosmopolitan genre of modern art. And she was one of the judges that he could trust. And let's see, she and Krasner was responsible for introducing him to many collectors, critics, and artists. John Bernard Myers, a noted art dealer, was once quoted as saying, there never would have been a Jackson Pollock without a Lee Pollock. And painter Fritz Bultmann referred to Pollock as Krasner's creation, her Frankenstein. That's interesting. They had different mentors. Krasner learned from Hans Hofmann, and Pollock received training from Thomas Hart Benton. So they had different approaches in their work. Krasner I learned about the importance of abstracting from nature and emphasizing the flat nature of a canvas, while Pollock's training highlighted the importance of complex design from automatic drawing. But Jackson also had influences on his wife's artwork. And many people thought that Krasner began to reproduce and reinterpret her husband's chaotic paint splatters in her own work. But her largest challenge as an artist was to establish a separation between herself and her husband that was not strictly the otherness of a woman. So here's a picture of Lee. She was born in 1908 and she lived to 1984. And she was an American abstract expressionist painter. She also used a lot of collage in her work. Although there was much cross-pollination between their two styles, the relationship somewhat overshadowed her contribution for some time. Krasner is now seen as a key transitional figure within abstraction who connected early 20th century art with the new ideas of post-war America, and her art fetches high prices at auction. She's also one of the few female artists who have had a retrospective show at the Museum of Modern Art. So here's one of her pieces from 1976, which is a collage and a painting. So many people think that she stopped working in 1940s in order to nurture Pollock's home life and career, but she never really stopped creating art. She shifted her focus from her own to Pollock's art in order to help him gain more recognition due to the fact that she believed he had much to give more to give in his art than in her own. I think I'm not going to go through all this because I want to show you some videos, but one of the things, the last point I thought was interesting, in the 1940s and 50s, Krasner would also would not sign work at all or sign with a genderless initials LK or blend her signature into the painting in order not to emphasize her status as a woman and as the wife of another painter. That was interesting. Okay, let's look at some videos on her.
That
Okay, we got a couple seconds of an ad to go through. Let's see, is it the beginning?
that face that is usually covered by her phone has finally made an appearance.
I think all painting is biographical. I think you can read any artist if you take the trouble to. The first approval comes in this form. This is so good, you would not know it was done by a woman. Yeah.
I once had that said to me.
Yeah.
Isn't it, it's the most peculiar feeling.
Yeah, I know. You put it beautifully. It's a most, you don't know quite what to do with the damn thing.
How does a painting incubate for you?
Heavy, heavy. What do you mean?
Trying to get into your head when you're standing there in front of that wall.
You just take a deep breath and hope for the best and get into it. And sometimes, as I say, it comes through miraculously. Anything can send me off to when it's time to get started, and then when the momentum gets going, the rapport starts, you know, then I'm in a work stretch. I did a batch of drawings. I had them pinned up in the whole studio. I went in one day, I hated them. I tore them all up and threw them on the floor. When I went into the studio again, which was several days later, they looked pretty good that way. This seems to be a work process of mine. I'm constantly going back to something I did earlier, remaking it, doing something else with it, and coming forth with another, more clarified image, possibly. I don't know. I can tell when the thing is alive and going, and that, you know, gets me all my adrenaline going, and then I want to stay with it. I pretty much know by now. And when it's a dead duck, I know that too. Color for me is a very mysterious thing. I might say, I haven't done anything in blue, I'm going to use blue. But then it's like it comes out green or alizarin crimson or something. I'm aware of that. I'm conscious of that kind of thing, but I don't try to change it. I don't say it's got to be blue. And I insist on letting it go the way it's going to go rather than forcing it. That kind of thing I hold on to zealously. I think that's the essence. You know, don't tamper with that. Don't will it. Don't force it. Let it come through in its own terms.
Uh-oh. Okay, let me close that. I like that video of her because you really get a sense of who she is and and her own power and her own thoughts about things. And you get to see her as an artist, not in herself. not just Jackson's wife. I want to show another couple videos.
Lee Krasner was a very formidable person and not easily daunted, and she decided very soon after Pollock's death to continue to make this series of paintings. And she was asked by an interviewer afterwards, how do you manage to do that? How do you paint in the depths of that degree of grief? And she says, painting is not separate from life, it is one. It's like asking, do I want to live? And my answer is yes, and so I paint.
Thank you, Eleanor, for being here today to come in and speak with us a bit about Lee Krasner and the incredible painting Eyes the First Circle. It's been 20 years since there has been a major exhibition devoted to Lee Krasner. Can you tell us about the show that you are organizing that will open at the Barbican later this year?
Absolutely. Lee Krasner has quite an important history with the UK. In 1965, Brian Robertson organised a major overview of her work, which came to London, to the Whitechapel, and then toured around the UK. My experience of spending time with Lee Krasner's work is that it's incredibly physical painting, and it has a very visceral impact upon the visitor. And because in the UK and indeed in Europe, people have generally only been able to engage with the work in reproduction, this is a fantastic opportunity for people to really feel the full impact of her painting as well as her collage and her works on paper in the flesh.
We know that Lee Krasner was married to Jackson Pollock, but she was a very accomplished artist in her lifetime. Can you tell us a bit about Lee Krasner, who she was, and what motivated her in her work and practice?
Krasner's born in 1908 in Brooklyn. She's the first child to be born in the US in her family who've emigrated from Russia. She grows up in a household where they're speaking Russian and Yiddish, and she's the first child to feel really like a Brooklynite. And she's very much going against the grain when she decides to become an artist. She makes that decision at 14 and really stays true to that vision, despite it being an incredibly difficult climate for anybody, but particularly a woman, to become an artist at that time. She meets Pollock for the first time in 1941 because they're exhibiting together. So they're showing together in John Graham's show, French and American Painting, at the Macmillan Gallery, and he's the only artist on the list that she doesn't know. She's familiar with de Kooning, she's familiar with Stuart Davis, and she doesn't know him, so she chooses to visit his studio. And the relationship to Pollock, of course, becomes an important one. They share their house in Springs, Long Island, until his death in 1956. But it's really only one chapter in a much longer story of her life as an artist and a woman.
Can you tell us about the course or evolution of her artwork, starting with the Little Images up until the Umber paintings? One thing that's so remarkable for me about the Little Image paintings is they really captured the all-over painting spirit that, of course, Jackson Pollock became so famous for and known for.
When she's working on the Little Image series, she's working in a very controlled vein. So she's generally working on a tabletop, on a flat surface, and she's working from an aerial perspective. So she's often thinning down oil paint with turpentine in a can, and she's working with small brushes. So the point at which she starts to work with unstretched canvas tacked to the wall, it's worth remembering that she's about 5'4" in height, and she refers to these as very gestural physical paintings because it required an entire performance for them to be made. And she would often try and go into a painting, and she would really work on it and work on it and work on it until she felt it had reached a point of completion. A painting like this, she felt relatively uncomfortable going into and leaving and going into and leaving because she wanted it to have that freshness about it, which is again one of the reasons why it doesn't feel overpainted, it doesn't feel thickly layered in the way that some of her earlier Little Image paintings were.
Can Can you talk about why her work is changing in the late 1950s? What's changed in sort of the circumstances in her life, in her working space, that lead to these much bolder, larger scale paintings?
The major change, of course, is the death of Pollock in 1956. There is already change afoot, so she had decided to go to France in the summer of 1956. It's the first time she travels to Europe, and she spends time in Paris, and she travels to the south and really kind of drinking in the history of French painting. Just before she'd left for this trip to France, she'd painted a painting that would become known as Prophecy, which I suppose we would think of today as being very heavy in allusions to Picasso, particularly Demoiselle d'Avignon. It's a very anguished painting. The color palette is very raw, incredibly fleshy, and she spoke about the degree of uneasiness she felt at the time of painting it. One of the quite touching things that Krasner and Pollock would do for each other was when they made something that felt like it was threatening to them, they would pose the question to the other one, is it a painting? He assured her and said, absolutely, keep going, don't walk away from it. That was the painting that hung on her easel at the point at which she leaves for France, and of course she's in Paris when she receives the call from Clement Greenberg to say that Pollock's dead. She decides to move out into Pollock's barn, his studio space. It must have been a very loaded space emotionally, but she's very practical. It's the largest space, it has the best natural light, and suddenly it allows her to take unstretched canvas, to tack it to the wall, and to make paintings that are 15 feet in length, which she has never done before. The Umber series really occurs at the peak of this moment of her discovering the possibilities of scale and the possibilities of this new space.
I was just going to note how, even though this canvas looks like it has some of the same motion as Pollock's paintings do, it's not as thick, it's not as layered, it seems more immediate and doesn't have it's more monochromatic. And so I found that very interesting, in that there are similar things about there's this style, but they feel very different to me.
Can you tell us why she sort of decided to pare back color, what the role of color is in these works?
The Umber series, as the title suggests, are made predominantly in raw and burnt umber, as well as white. They're made in oil. She really enjoyed the organic properties of working in oil, and the color has that organic quality as well. Umber was something that she could really make her own. And she speaks of it as a very practical gesture, that she was working at night, she was suffering from extreme insomnia, and she had been trained quite formally as a colorist and believed that it was almost a criminal act to work with color without natural light. And so working with umber allowed her to continue to work even in these very difficult circumstances. She does a very interesting interview with the poet Richard Howard, who was a great friend of hers. It was Richard Howard who'd actually suggested the title for this painting, The Eye is the First Circle, which comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson. When she speaks to Richard Howard, she says, I was going down deep into something which wasn't easy, it wasn't pleasant. You know, she speaks of it as a descent into the depths of grief. She spoke very eloquently in the interview she did with Richard Howard about wanting to ensure that much of this brushwork remained very light. You know, it has this very feathery quality to the mark making. And that, for her, was about staying close to that original impulse. She wanted all of what was driving her to make this painting to remain very alive within the work. It's remarkable that it manages to retain such strong impact today.
It will be exciting to see how this painting fits into your exhibition. But can you talk about how this painting fits into the story of Lee Krasner overall?
In many ways, she considered it a kind of pinnacle moment. She chose for it to be included in the 1965 exhibition that Robertson did at the Whitechapel and worked very closely with him on that, and likewise the show that Marcia Tucker organised in 1973 at the Whitney. Again, it then became a major part of Barbara Rose's retrospective at MoMA in 1984. At these various moments when Krasner's work has been appraised, The Eye is the First Circle has been a really important means through which to consider the achievements of her career.
Let's see. I have one more. We have time to do one more video. Oh, I missed the video. Only saw. I will, Georgia, I will give the links to Kat. I don't know which one you missed, but I'll give all the links to Kat for you to watch on your own. I have one more video. This is from the Tate at a recent exhibition.
There's an indescribable energy to the paintings of Lee Krasner. Swirls of colour, mosaic collages, paintings that surprise you with their scale. The Barbican's new exhibition is a joyous celebration of an artist who was too often overshadowed by her husband, the father of abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock.
We call the exhibition Lee Krasner Living Colour, and it was because we wanted to celebrate both her literal use of colour and her metaphorical, sort of colourful, passionate, vivacious attitude towards life, which I think is what comes across so powerfully in the work. It's what makes us so seduced by it, actually.
But the exhibition is also about changing perceptions. It's about emphasizing that Krasner was an established artist when she met Pollock. That she studied art, including under Hans Hofmann, a famous teacher who'd known Matisse and Kandinsky.
We show upstairs some of the work that she does for the War Services Project. That's in the 1940s. She's able to get that job because she's already a really respected figure in that scene. There are also, throughout her lifetime, many individuals, curators and critics who are great champions of her work. So it's more that we've been left in a situation in Europe where, because there's very little of the work here, we simply don't have an opportunity to appreciate her as an artist.
So I just wanted to note that I know there's a few collage artists among us, so to notice her, the collage she does.
Krasner's work straddles mediums and styles. She created this mosaic table out of scraps from her life with Pollock. He died in a car crash in 1956, which sent Krasner into a spiral of grief. But it was also a huge source of inspiration, since her work after his death is on a new size and scale.
We see colour becomes a central theme within her work, from the little image paintings, which are in the first rooms of the exhibition. But also, it then becomes something that's not just about when she does use colour, it's also about when she abstains from using colour. So we see that in the night journeys downstairs, that this is this period of very intense grief for her. She's suffering from extreme insomnia, and she says the only way she can continue to work at night under artificial light is if she completely restricts her palette to raw umber, burnt umber, and a kind of off-white colour. So it's something that we can also look at as a kind of barometer for her as an artist, for how she's feeling and operating and working. And I think that's lovely to see within the show, that sense of how her life force ebbs and flows across the years.
There is only one Krasner painting in a public collection in the UK, the 1961 piece Gothic Landscape, which is held by the Tate.
But between now and September, the Barbican will be displaying 100 of her works. And seeing the riot of shape, colour and expression here, I don't think Krasner will be thought of in the UK as Jackson Pollock's wife, any longer, but first and foremost as an artist in her own right. Miranda Ratti, TRT World, London.
An artist in her own right. To help us reframe Lee Krasner, UK editor of ArtNet News, Javier Pes joins me. Javier, so in the exhibition there are 100 works displayed, most of which are being shown for the first time in the UK. How do you think this will affect the recognition of Lee Krasner in Europe?
I think the exhibition at the Barbican Centre, which is the first in London for 5 decades, it's great. It reminds Europeans just how good she was and how important she was in that moment when New York becomes the centre of the art world after the Second World War.
And what is your impression of the works on display?
The works, you can't help but be impressed with the scale of them, with their vibrancy, and also how she had her own voice. I think this show also reminds us that she wasn't just Jackson Pollock's wife. You know, another great American abstract artist. That she had her own. She was her own artist.
In your article, you put together 5 battles that Lee Krasner faced, and the first one is being Mrs. Jackson Pollock. Tell me more about it.
Well, it was one of the great love affairs that, you know, Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock fall in love. They move out to a farm outside of New York, and then they create extraordinary works. Jackson Pollock is obviously the bigger name, and she helped him become, you know, America's sort of one of America's leading painters. She also had to cope with his alcoholism and his, you know, violence. And then so when he dies in a car crash, she's got kind of 2 jobs to do, really, to protect his legacy, but also to protect a space for herself as an artist. And she famously, after a while, moves into the barn where Jackson Pollock had the space to paint huge canvases, and she could suddenly, you know, move out of the bedroom in the farm to the barn and also create works that were really as impressive in scale. And
okay, so you got to see who Lee is, and I'm curious, any feedback about her as an artist and as a person, and what do you think about her use of collage? I mean, it looked like most of her collage was not from outside sources, but collaging her own drawings and her own paintings, and repurposing and putting them together to have a different energy. So I know we got some collage artists here, and I'm just wondering if you've tried to do that yourself, is collage your own work, or if you've mostly been collaging work from outside. Well, am I gonna hear from Linda or Maria about that? We were doing collage at in person for a bit of time, and so I'm just, it is interesting. I haven't done that much collage with my own work, a bit of it, but not a lot. So yeah, they had an amazing history, and were important forces in this new focus on the U.S. And New York as the art center after Paris being that for many years. So I think it's interesting that her work at the end is at the Tate, and I'm not sure what I didn't know what year that was that exhibit was, but that she came back as a force of abstract expressionism. So, any other comments?
I like her work better than his.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Why do you say that, Simon? What do you like better about it?
Well, it's more honest to me.
Honest in a
Throwing
way.
paint on the ground doesn't impress me that much.
Well, she sort of took it a different way. She used color in a very different way, and they were saying that her use of color kind of was a barometer of how she was feeling or what she was going through. But when you think about Picasso was doing that too, right, with his blue phase and his rose phase. So I guess it's not uncommon that artists will go through certain colors to represent what's happening in their lives at the time. Okay. Next week I'm gonna be talking about Christo. And it's interesting how many, I don't know about in this group, but in one of my other classes, there's quite a few people that were able to get out and see his work. Notably the Umbrella series that was here on the West Coast. So it'd be interesting to hear stories from those of you who might have been able to see that show. Okay, so that's it for today.
Thank you.
You're welcome, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Okay.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.